Welcome to the 9th lecture, the Introduction to Environmental Science. The Population Challenge, Growing Human Population. Measuring its impact. That's one of the things we try to do. We try to measure what's going on here. This is a graphic of sorts. You look at this and see, that looks like the letter S. Oops, come on now. There we go. Now let's have the letter S. Letter S, yeah. Or this one kind of looks like the letter J. Well, you've seen this sort of a graphic before. You've got this nice exponential growth going on here. But how about the S? Well, we'll get into that in this lecture. So, what we're talking about. Understanding populations and population growth. Measuring population growth, total fertility rate, and replacement level fertility. That's an important part of growth of populations. Migration, both immigration and emigration. I hate those two words. They're terrible to say. Population histograms and how populations grow or how they appear. Exponential growth, it's sort of that idea that, well, that's what the J-curve is all about. How long can it last? A growing human population. Why has the human population grown so large? We sort of talked about this in the last lecture and the one before that too. But we'll have some more to say about it. Can we expand the Earth's carrying capacity? In other words, how many people can the Earth actually support? That's carrying capacity. Well, we'll talk about that too. And what is the Earth's carrying capacity for humans? I wonder if we can actually come up with an answer to that question. I'll put a question mark out by that one. The future of world population. Maximum human carrying capacity. We've talked about that a couple of times here. Why should we worry about population growth in developing nations? You might be able to guess at that from a previous lecture. So, what is demography, demographics? Demography, the study of statistics which illustrates the changing structure of human populations. That's this exponential graph we see here. Where's it going to end up? It involves all of these different, statistical measurements. Growth rate, how fast are human beings growing in terms of a population? How many of us are being born over a certain period of time? In the previous lecture we saw that during the lecture I think that there was 7,000 humans were born, or the net increase in the population of the planet was 7,000 people during that lecture. Doesn't mean there were certainly births and deaths. So there's death rate, also fit in with that same number. Doubling time. How long does it take for a population to double? Total fertility rate and replacement level fertility. That's one of those things that we'll get more into. Populations have certain characteristics. So a population is a group of interbreeding individuals, the same species in the same geographic area. That's the definition of a population. Lots of populations around the world. That's the definition. Think of population dynamics. What are the characteristics of populations that change in response to environmental conditions? Changes in population characteristics can happen for a variety of reasons. Because of temperature. Wow, okay, why would that be? Well, presence of disease organisms or harmful come back up to temperature. So we have, living here in Central Florida, we have a migration of sorts every year because it gets cold up north, and we have these things we call lovingly snowbirds. Snowbirds migrate down here because of temperature, because it gets cold up north. Resource availability is another reason why population characteristics change. Populations may no longer be able to support themselves because of a drought or because of a flood. It eliminates certain amounts of land. Arrival or disappearance of species that might be in competition with a population of organisms. So, population size is governed by the number of births minus the number of deaths. And then this term I lovingly call migration. Migration means moving into a population, and migration. See, it's easier to see it written out than it is to say it. immigration, it's the same thing. Anyway, moving out of a population. So, population growth is equal to the number of births plus the movement in the immigration of organisms minus the number of deaths plus those that moved out of that population, the ammigration. Age structure is the number of individuals of reproductive age, which for human beings is about age 14. Come on, next slide. There we go. Reproductive age is about 15, I think they say, to about 45, according to the experts. And post-reproductive age is, of course, anybody who's older than 45 years. There are several different patterns for populations, but most populations live in clumps. For example, this is a map, you can see it right there, of a certain geographic area. If you're not familiar with this geographic area, this happens to be Highlands County, Florida, where we're located. About right there is where South Florida State College is. This is the Kissimmee River. We've talked about that. We'll talk about that more in the future. But how is the human population clumped in this geographic area? Hazard to guess. Well, I'll just draw this circle here, and really most of the people are located, human beings are located here on the ridge, because that is where the resources are that we need. That's where the utilities are. That's where the roads are. That's where the water supply is. You go off the ridge, you look at what's going on off the ridge, out over in here, and you have lots and lots of ag, and lots of water, actually. It's quite a bit wetter out in these other parts. So, human populations are definitely clumped within this area here, within the ridge portion. Not so much in the others. Populations cannot grow indefinitely. Biotic potential, capacity for population growth, it is low in certain species. Think of species that grow slowly, like whales, elephants. Pretty high in species such as bacteria or rabbits. For example, this is actually bacteria growth, and this is an example of exponential bacteria growth under unlimited conditions. In other words, the bacteria have exactly what they need, perfect temperature, perfect amount of nutrients. This is in minutes, starting from 0 with one bacterium up to 30 minutes. And you may not be able to make out that scale, but that's 1,200,000 bacteria in a little more than 30 minutes of growth from a single. That's exponential growth if they grow. The number doubles every minute. So that's a pretty high capacity for bacterial growth, or for organism growth. What we're looking at here is this intrinsic rate of increase, or R. We'll come back to that quite a bit. The rate at which a species would grow if it had unlimited resources. And for bacteria, that's pretty darn fast. Clearly we limit bacteria growth somehow. So, what's next? There we go. Individuals with populations with high intrinsic rate of increase, or high R's, they reproduce early in life, bacteria, every minute. Have very short generation times, can reproduce many times, have many offspring each time they reproduce. Bacteria, they have that huge biotic potential, and this is every 20 minutes, well in the example I gave just for graphing purposes every minute. This is one of the assignments. I've got more on it later in this lecture. Go to the worldpopulationbalance.org website, and there's some actually interesting exercises to be done there. So, little exponential growth. Growth at a fixed yearly rate. Anytime it is at a fixed rate, anything that has rate associated with it is exponential growth. When graphed, that exponential growth starts slowly. You've seen this before. That's just the graph. Starts slowly and then suddenly builds up. If unchecked, you can get overshoot. Talk about that in the next graphic. Resource recovery and pollution assimilation, they can't keep up with how fast any population, in this case, it may be a human population that's growing. So, let's look at this ideal J curve. This is actually a human population. You've seen this several times. Versus a thing called an S curve. So there you got the J here. See the J? Yeah. The S-curve. This is when a species reaches a certain point, it plateaus off, that S-shape curve. Size of populations limited by some examples: light, certainly for plants, water for almost all organisms. Space. Space may not seem like, well, yeah, it's important, but for some plants you can't get a big tree unless you have enough space for it. Nutrients limit growth of all organisms. Competition. What is actually out competing for the nutrients and the space and the water and the light? Being eaten is a big thing that limits a lot of populations. A disease is another thing that limits the size of populations. So, population growth in nature is always limited. It's something Thomas Malthus tried to get at 200 plus years ago, and we're still struggling with it. So, this is an example of a population that started out growing quickly, and then it kind of flattened out. So what went on here? These are actually sheep. There are things called, things that factor into this, this graphic of environmental resistance. There are factors that limit population growth. So, what we see in this graphic is that the sheep population grows up to a point till it reaches what is known as the carrying capacity. The carrying capacity of this particular environment for these sheep is the largest sustainable population without habitat degradation. What happens after you reach this carrying capacity, this population number, these are actual data, I think, from Australia, and this is millions of sheep in that axis. So the number of sheep overshoots the carrying capacity, then the population drops, and then it bounces back and forth around that carrying capacity because the environment can't support more. Exponential growth is where we start off with here. Exponential growth is this portion of the graph right in here. You can't see yellow on yellow. Change that. How about green? There we go. The exponential growth is a part of the graph that is what we see normally, that J-curve part of it. However, what we look at over the long term is a flattening out, a thing called logistic growth. Exponential growth followed by a decrease or leveling off of the population so that you have logistic growth. That's just the term for it. So when a population exceeds its habitat's carrying capacity, the population can crash. These happen to be elk, I believe, or moose, large animals, and just numbers on this axis and time on this axis. And what happened, this orange line here, that is the carrying capacity. That's K. Don't forget the letter K. Carrying capacity is not fixed. It can vary in time. In other words, in the wintertime, a particular part of habitat can support a certain number of organisms, but it can support a lot more in the summertime. Sometimes it varies in space within a river or a lake system. There is a reproductive time lag, so you have this time lag going on here with this animal, the elk, I believe. The period it takes, so they're rapidly reproducing here in response to environmental conditions, and then they have a spike in the number of organisms, and then the environment cannot support them because their carrying capacity is way down here. So this is a term called overshoot. You have dieback, and then environmental damage can happen. We see this in deer populations where they will come in if there's nothing to graze them down, or to, I guess, to cull the herd, if you will. And they will overgraze a certain area, and their the population will shoot up because they've got enough food. But then there's nothing to take care of the excess, if you will, and there's massive die-off because the deer starve to death and get disease-ridden. So we see the same thing. It's a natural condition. A little different idea I want to introduce now. A thing called total fertility rate, TFR. The average number of children a woman will bear in her lifetime. So this replacement level fertility is reproduction at that exact level necessary for couples to replace themselves. 2.1 children per woman. That doesn't mean that to replace, there's a certain infant mortality that's taken into effect. There's a certain number of children who are born who won't make it to adulthood. So it takes 2.1 children on average, and this has been the case measured for decades. Due to immigration, movement in, and momentum from the lag effect, most populations will not reach zero population growth when they reach this replacement level reproduction. 2.1 children per woman for humans is replacement level reproduction or replacement level fertility. Remember migration? Migration is actually technically a round trip, like the birds that migrate up to the Arctic Circle and migrate back. That's a round trip. Immigration and emigration usually are a permanent relocation. So, migration, number of individuals moving in a population. Two forms of it, as I said before. The movement into a country and the movement out of a country. Immigration and emigration. Net migration is equal to in movement, immigration, minus the out movement, or the emigration. Zero population growth for any population can only be reached when the growth rates and net migration are zero. The growth rate to zero is not the same as having zero population or zero fertility rate. In fact, that'd be bad. Internal migration has profound demographic as well as economic and environmental effects in the United States. Particularly over the last, say, 50 years in the United States, we've seen a change in the demographic where a lot of people have moved from the more populated industrial centers in the Northeast into the more business-oriented, well, the sunny South, if you will. The cities in the South have grown tremendously because of that, which has left a lot of areas of the Northeast in not as good a shape. So why has the human population grown so large? This is a graphic of life expectancy starting in 1950. And you can see that all right. And it's projected, of course, this was taken a few years ago, but we're about right here. The purple line is life expectancy worldwide. I'm sorry, that's not right. The life expectancy in more developed areas. You can see that in 1950, the life expectancy in more developed areas was about 67 years. Let me change to a pen so we can actually see what I'm writing here. Now let me change to my pen so I can see what I'm writing here. There we go. Oh, much clearer, sure. So we have the more developed regions is the purple line here. The world average is actually this black line. In 1950, the more developed regions had an average life expectancy of 67 years, and it's right now it's probably about 78 years. The less developed regions, which is this green line down here, was about 40 years in 1950. And currently, that life expectancy in less developed areas is up at about 65 years. So it's come a long way. Worldwide, the worldwide average is a little bit between, but closer to the more developed, the developing areas. Population growth in modern times due to two factors: slightly increased reproductive rates, dramatically, this is the main thing, dramatically decreased death rates. That's really what's driving things. It's contributed to a much higher average life expectancy. So looking at the United States, this is the births per woman, the total fertility rate. In 1920, that hovered about 3. We went through this baby boom after World War II, and it jumped up to about almost 4.5. And after the baby boom, it has kind of dropped down. This line here is 2.1. Remember, 2.1, 0.1. All right, thank you. That is the replacement level fertility rate. That is where we're actually replacing, a couple will replace themselves with offspring, with children. So today we are hovering, well, a little bit after today, but 2010 we were at 2.1. You can see how things have changed over that time period. So the births per thousand in 1920 was about 28. It's much lower today. So why has our population grown so much? Because of those other factors we talked about. So 1920, the population was about 28 children per thousand. Into World War II, it jumped back up to almost that same height, but it has declined pretty steadily since a little boom there in the around 2000. And today it stands at about 14 children per thousand. It's the carrying capacity. So advances in tools, agriculture, medicine, technology, all of these things have enabled us to increase the Earth's carrying capacity. More of us. While it's necessary for us to provide for this expanding human population, it's also increased the amount of pollution. It's depleted a lot of natural resources. So what is the Earth's carrying capacity for humans? This is a big number. It's really more than you would think. Accurate estimates of the carrying capacity are difficult because of a lot of variables. What's going to happen in 10 years? Are we going to suddenly increase the ability to carry more people? Many people think human populations already exceeds the Earth's long-term carrying capacity. Looking at it as an unstable condition, that footprint idea, where it's taken really 1.3 Earths to support us today. The ecological footprint concept. So, Earth's carrying capacity for humans. This red line is the UN high fertility variant, if you will, 2008 version. We are sitting, well, we're about right here, about halfway between 2010 and 2020. And the world population, as we saw in the previous lecture, was 7.43 billion, approximately. So, under that high variant, the UN's estimate is that by 2050, we'll have more than 10 billion. The U.S. Census Bureau, which is this blue line, thinks that worldwide the population will get up just about 9 billion. If you look at the UN medium fertility, this yellow line is less than that 9 billion, about 8 billion, if you will. The purple line, you go down. The low fertility, if we reduce the fertility of people all over the world, the population will be, well, about the same as it is now, 7.6 billion in 2050, which is certainly perhaps more sustainable. So there is some optimism for us in terms of how many people we actually have on the Earth. So, growth rate, talked about this before, and in percent. Remember, the crude birth rate minus the crude death rate times 100. Birth rates for human population are influenced by the age of marriage, education level, contraceptive use, female employment, couples' desires, beliefs, and values. All that affects our birth rates. We make those decisions. One of the things we have definitely seen is a rapidly falling death rate. We have a lot better sanitation, much cleaner water supplies, a lot better at getting rid of waste. We have a lot greatly improved medical treatment. There's more medicines available, and we're getting more medical treatment to people who need it. Improved agriculture, improved food, certainly more food available for people to eat, although you know of these pockets of places where war interrupts the distribution of food, and there are other economic depravities that happen, but for the most part, in the absence of war, we have a tremendous ability to provide food for people. It all adds up to improved living conditions for most of the humans on the planet. So, measuring population growth. Let's look at doubling time. There's an idea called the rule of 70. Mostly it's thought of for investments. Okay. Used to determine how long something growing at an exponential rate will take to double. Remember, rate, anything that's increasing over a year. So, doubling time is equal to 70 divided by the growth rate in percent. At the current rate of growth, of 1.8%, this is worldwide, developing nations will double in their population in about 33 years. Growth rates in developing countries, on average, far exceed those of developed nations. Let me use a little math here. It's always a risk for me to do that. 0.1% is approximately the rate at which certain Scandinavian countries are growing. So if we say 0.1% is the growth rate, and we divide 70 by 0.1%, that's equal to 700 years. That's the approximate doubling time for Scandinavian countries at their current rate of growth. That means they're probably not going to double in population. Indeed, the developing nations double quite a bit more frequently than that. So this is the actual numbers here. Worldwide, we're looking at doubling our population in 58 years. The more developed countries, this is a smaller number than I came up with Scandinavia, but more developed countries have a growth rate of about 0.2%. The actually North America growth rate is about 0.6%, 117 years. This is more accurate for the number I gave for Europe. Really, their growth rate is 0. They will never double in terms of their population. So what are we going to do? How are we going to, looks like we need to manage the growth rates in more developed countries and perhaps reduce it and increase it, or somehow change the demographics so that we're more balanced worldwide. Our population can grow, decline, or remain fairly stable. So population change is equal to births plus this. You might see this again. I've been through this a couple of times now. Immigration means movement in, and immigration means moving out. You won't be asked to pronounce these audibly on a test, so hopefully you'll just remember that EM means out, IM means in of population. So another definition for you. Crude birth rate is the number of live births per 1,000 people in a population in a given year. Crude death rate is the same thing, kind of opposite view of it. Number of deaths per 1,000 people in a given year. So, here is an interesting graphic. This will roll down a little bit. Fertility rate. This is the total fertility rate. We talked about this before. Total fertility rate. Over time, starting in 1955. 1955. That's not a right number. Hang on just a second. Don't do that. Come back here. The wrong button. You'd think I'd figure these buttons out by now, but it'll probably take me about another the rest of the term to figure them out. So 1955. Once again, we're about right here at 2016 when this is recorded, projecting it out to 2050. So fertility rate. Replacement level fertility rate for human beings, remember, is 2.1, about right there. That's the total fertility rate. Why we've dropped this population? The less developed countries, the total fertility rate was about 6 children per woman in 1955, and it's dropped dramatically to a little more than 3 today. Worldwide, same thing. In the developed world, we're right just barely holding our own at 2.1. Remember, that's that replacement level. So why is this not low enough already to stabilize the world's population? I mean, for goodness sake, it started dropping at about the early 1960s. You think by now we would have reduced the population. Well, we haven't. We need to look at the number of future parents that have already been born that are going to have children. That kind of explains it. So what affects death rates? We have the same sort of a graphic. In this, these are less developed countries. This is infant mortality rate, deaths per 1,000 live births. And once again, this starts in 1960, but it was more than 150. In the more developed countries, about 50. And we are sitting right here, once again, middle part of this decade. And the infant mortality rate in the developed world has dropped by 100, if you will. It's dropped from 150 down to 50, and in the developed world, if you will, it's dropped down to about 10 infant deaths per 1,000 live births. fits into life expectancy. We talked about this at in the last lecture. We talked about the cavemen. So, infant mortality rate has dropped tremendously. Why are people living longer and fewer infants dying? Well, it goes back to the answers we gave before. Better food supply, better distribution, better nutrition, medical advances, sanitation. Really, those 3 things, 4 things, 5 things are the answers. Let's look at population age structures in a little bit more detail. So we have some age structure categories for human beings. Once again, pre-reproductive is birth to 14 years. Reproductive is 15 to 44 years, and post-reproductive is anyone over 45, that's statistically speaking. Future population growth is tied to age structure, the age structure of a population. We talk about populations, we're talking about for a particular country. Social and economic priorities are set by the majority of a given population in an age structure. Now, majority doesn't necessarily mean majority in terms of total numbers. We'll give you an example. In this particular county, Highlands County, Florida, 33% of our population is over age 65. That's the second highest rate per capita of any county in the nation. A lot of our priorities are set by that population. Population histograms, let's look at those things. So as a graphic representation of the age structure and the gender distribution of a population. We don't really think about gender distribution, we think it's 1-to-1. It's not true. A lot of shifts in population structure can signal dramatic changes in the economic, employment infrastructure, and healthcare needs of a given population. So, there's some examples. I'm going into more details about these. But these, the blue areas, those are the post-reproductive populations. The yellow areas are the reproductive portions, and the red areas are the pre-reproductive portions. Let's look at these in a bit more detail. Looking at the this one, I forgot to take that slide out. Okay, well, whatever. In this case, this is an age structure where you have a population expanding rapidly. Once again, a lot of young, both males and females, although there are more males in these nations than females. And then you go into the reproductive ages, and it's this sort of a pyramid that you have. A lot of young have been born already. They're going to move their way up through this pyramid. You'll notice that towards the top, not so noticeable right about 45, but later, not much later in life, the number of women greatly outnumbers the number of men. Women live longer. Slowly expanding population, for example, us, China, we have these same sorts of things. More stable. This is, approximately the 2.1 birth rate, but you'll notice there's a much larger proportion of the post-reproductive population that is female compared to that part that is male. So not nearly as steep a pyramid, if you will. These countries have stable populations, and stable is, well, it's okay, except you got to make sure that you're able to support these other the growing number of people who are simply they're going to be old and they take more care. They're not contributing as much. We talked about this in the last lecture, I think. And then those populations that have declining are in decline in terms of their population. They simply don't have enough young to come up and replace the elderly up here at the top. You notice that the age structure becomes even more skewed towards females in this particular graphic. So these are all those European countries talk about that don't have a doubling time. Their population is not ever going to double, at least not in the foreseeable future. Populations, most of older people, can decline very rapidly. When that total fertility falls below 1.5 for an extended period of time, the population declines. The elderly cost more to care for and contribute the least, relatively speaking, to economic growth. Yes, I know I'm getting up there towards elderly, but it's true for everyone. When you have labor shortages, that's because if you don't have enough people to fill those roles that help support the elderly, I'll say dig ditches. I'm too old to dig ditches now, and it hurts my back. But to do that sort of manual labor, you need young people to do that. That's just the way it is. You can end up with, and they're running into this, certainly in Scandinavian countries, severe social problems when you have to care for that elderly population. We see all these issues in some European countries, and we may see them in China. Remember, I said in the last lecture, I believe, that the population of China is projected to decrease by 100 million, which is a lot of people between 2025 and 2050. And that will only bring their total population from 1.5 billion down to 1.4 billion. But nevertheless, their age structure is starting to turn upside down. So let's look at population densities. Where were the people in the 1990s? Once again, density is equal to number per area. And I believe this is in square kilometers, but that's here nor there. For the colors, the darker blues, you can see India is fairly dark, Japan is fairly dark. These European countries, in 1950, there's not a lot of density of folks living in Australia. The United States is moderately, we've got a good distribution. So you can see those hot spots. But what happens, let's fast forward to 2014. India has grown more, certain parts of Europe, but look how much China has increased. Let me see if I can go back. Probably can't. Yeah, there we go. I can go back. You can kind of play back and forth between these two slides. A lot of Indonesia is actually also looking like it's got a much larger population. Population in Africa, these African nations has increased a great deal. Some small countries over in South America have also increased a great deal. So one more look back. We can barely see any of those other countries, but not that far back. There we go. So, increasing economic development tends to decrease population growth. We're going to look at something called demographic transitions. What are the stages of these demographic transitions? So, we have a pre-industrial demographic, pre-modern in the slide that follows. You have a transition from the pre-industrial into the, this is what happens sometimes when you're trying to transition from pre-industrial to an industrial standpoint. May lead to a demographic trap, so to speak. So the population may still rapidly growing, but it may not develop the economic support the industry to actually support the people who live there. And of course, industrial, you might guess that one. And post-industrial. Post-industrial, well, that might be like us or other parts of the developed world. So, demographic transition. I already answered that question. Maybe I shouldn't have. So, you start out with a pre-industrial, pretty much an agricultural society. This blue and red line, those are birth rates and death rates. And in these pre-industrial societies, populations, you can see that those are almost balanced, quite high actually, relatively speaking. And the actual total population is low. The growth rate over time is quite low in these pre-industrial sort of populations. So, transitional often takes a great deal of time. So the population, you remember that the exponential growth, the population of these populations that are in transition increase rapidly, the growth rate becomes very high, and then the total population increases. But over time, it starts to decrease. When this population becomes industrial, growth slows, both the birth and death rates have dropped, and you have all these other advantages of an industrial, more education, more health, more sanitation. And then as you move into the post-industrial, you're actually going to end up with negative growth. because your birth rate has dropped quite low. The death rate stays pretty stable throughout all of from the time you're industrial to post-industrial. There's not a great change in that. So this is more specific demographics for various countries. Talked about Germany. The birth rate and death rate, and this is starting in 1820. And, where's 1900? I think 1900 is about right there. Did I get that right? Yep, that's 1900 right there. And you can see that the total population in Germany is kind of flattened out. There's some things that happened. This is 1950. There's a lot more data taken in 1950. Look at these graphics more carefully. This is actually from a website called ourworldindata.org. Check that out. Maybe I'll make that available to you later. But we have the total population of each of these countries has increased over this time period. But there's a big change. China didn't see this increase until post-World War II. Germany had already gone through this increase about the time of the turn of the century. Sweden has pretty much been flat for quite a while. Chile has went through a number of transitions in the late 1800s and early 1900s. It's pretty much stabilized in terms of their population since that time, since about 1975. So what is the future of world populations? There are estimates that the maximum human carrying capacity is a lot more than we have on the planet today. Let that number sink in. That's a lot of people. 500 billion to a million, 1,000 billion. 1,000 billion, I think, is also a trillion. It's kind of a British thing. Anyway, no finite system like we have on the Earth. We only have one Earth, one planet, can accommodate infinite population growth. We are still growing like this. Why should we worry about population growth in developing nations? Why should we worry about that? Maybe it's okay. Growing international population increases the production of food for export. Places additional stress on the ag system. We have to produce more food for more people. Expanding world population results in a lot of habitat destruction, loss of valuable species, but we have to feed ourselves. So there's the conundrum. Do we slow down on the agricultural expansion and perhaps people starve to death? Actually, that's probably what would happen. Or do we continue to destroy habitat and lose valuable species? We don't even know how valuable they are. They may be the cure to whatever we need in the future. Population growth also makes global warming worse. The cycle of poverty keeps going round and round in developing nations. We'll talk in a later chapter about the Philippines and some of the places where people live in the Philippines. And there's also this, which we won't get into in this course because it's just too new and there's so much change going on and I just don't feel I can wrap my head around it. But in 2015, 1 million people tried to migrate to Europe, most of them from Africa, Syria, and the Middle East. That caused a crisis where you saw that the population, the growth rate for many Scandinavian countries is 0. So perhaps they need these people there, but how do you get them there and how do you sort out who's who? That's why it's a crisis. So, sustainable resource use, balance supply and demand, has to balance between supply and demand. So, the term environmental sustainability, the ability to sustain the exploitation of natural capital, is what we're doing. We have to have these natural resources to meet our growing human needs. Often, we look at ag, forestry, fisheries exploitation. We'll talk about several of those. I'm not sure we'll talk all that much about human ag, but certainly fisheries, we'll talk about that a lot. Natural capital, natural resources provided by ecosystems. We've seen this before. It's the air, it's the water, it's the soil, it's the nutrients, whatever it takes to grow the crops that we need to keep us healthy. Environmental sustainability is based upon the idea of sustainable yield. Well, what does that mean? Don't harvest something faster than it can replace itself. Sustainable resource use is constrained by supply and demand. The rate at which resources are being supplied versus the rate at which they're being consumed or harvested. That, in a nutshell, is sustainable yield. You have to balance those two to make sure that you are not consuming things faster than they can be replaced, regenerated. So, seen this picture before. This is China, I believe. And this graphic, this slide sort of gets a little bit, I don't know, preachy, I guess. But the root of virtually all environmental problems, including pollution, resource depletion, is too many people. Urban despair in many places is caused by overpopulation. Rural despair is caused by too many people in rural areas do the same thing. All the social, economic, and environmental problems are made worse, are exacerbated by the fact that we have had a rapidly growing population. We still have a rapidly growing population. We certainly have reduced the rate of population growth. And how we solve these environmental problems are hampered by the rapid population growth of humans. So this is the assignment for Lecture 9. It's on exponential growth. It's a site called World Population Balance. Excellent resource for understanding exponential growth. This is a link. Actually, that's not hot linked here, but C D2L. This is available for you to take, I believe, to work on if you've already finished the Lecture 8 assignment in particular. All right, what will we talk about in this lecture? Understanding populations and population growth. Yep, talk about that. Measuring population growth is not easy to do. Total fertility rate and replacement level fertility. Remember, replacement level fertility for human beings is 2.1 children per couple. Migration and immigration and emigration. Population histograms. How we saw some populations are growing that way, some of them are growing more like this. Exponential growth. We have that nice J-curve. And then logistic growth, which is the S-curve. I'm going to put this up here and remind you of that growth curve as well. So the growing human population. Excuse me. Why is the human population grown so large? For a lot of good reasons. We're better at sanitation. We're better at, we have better health care. Lots of different reasons. Do we need to expand the Earth's carrying capacity, or do we need to reduce the rate at which we grow? So it was 500 billion to a trillion. I'm not going to write 1,000 billion up there. To a trillion is what some experts think our population could grow to. So what is the Earth's actual carrying capacity for humans? We're still figuring that out. Future world populations. What is the maximum human carrying capacity? Wow, that's, I think, that 500 billion to 1 trillion. Why should we worry about population growth in developing nations? Because it's going to take increasing amounts of resources to support them. But if we can stabilize our population growth, perhaps we're already in good shape. Maybe not. The references. Annotations have images, and I'm going to pull actually our discussion forum for this particular unit from one of these slides. One of the previous slides. So those are the references. Please check them out and contact me with questions about this particular lecture.